set of criteria and a manual that has many diagnostic criteria. So difficult to go through all of those tonight, but again, for the purpose of our discussion, give you some information about that. Children can show signs at a very early age of some mental health concerns. And some of the statistics that I came across said that half of all mental disorders show first signs before the age of 14 for some individuals, and up to 3/4 before the age of 24. So it's clear that children and young adults can certainly suffer from mental illness. Another statistic that I found that said that up to less than 20% of the youth that do suffer from a mental illness receive the treatment that they need. So clearly there's a big lack of care or ability to reach that care, just as Sheila had mentioned. Mental health disorders are not, and this is going back to also what Sheila said, they're not, a personality weakness or character flaw. This is old pervasive thinking, but it's still, I think, some thinking that is still present that is a barrier to seeking care. And particularly, in some families, if a parent or a grandparent or anyone perceives that to be a weakness, then, that can be sort of, get over it, or just, get better or suck it up or whatever sort of attitude, but that in and of itself can be a big barrier to actually getting the help that a person needs, or to getting your family member to that help. Contributing factors to mental illness include genetics. There can be a familial predisposition, illness or injury, trauma, and abuse situations, which we're going to learn more about tonight. I wanted to touch just very briefly on some warning signs, but it's not meant to be a complete or exhaustive list of symptoms, but just some things that, if you are, with a family member or a friend or a neighbor or are a caregiver for children, these are some things that you could look out for. Eating or sleeping too much or too little. Isolation, pulling away from your usual activities, or just withdrawing, low energy or no energy, feeling or appearing that nothing matters, or just, feeling like, or giving the appearance that you just don't care about things, pain, again, feelings of helplessness or hopelessness, again, substance abuse, which can, include smoking too much, drinking too much, abuse of other substances, also just thinking that doesn't seem clear, forgetful, worried, just confused, fighting often with your family and friends, having mood swings, and then, other things such as seeing things that aren't there, hearing things that aren't there, voices, a belief in something that's just not true. That would be it's significant of like delusional thinking, and important thoughts of harm, either self-harm or harming others, and then inability to participate in daily tasks. Again, just some signs that there could be something more going on. And we will learn more with the panel that prevention can help, and we'll learn more tonight about the ways that we can recognize and help children, youth and young adults, and promote their social and emotional well-being. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Nancy.
Thank you, Chris. I too want to thank you for your interest and being here tonight. My passion has always been the well-being of our children, and with that, well-being of the families and the other systems that interact with children. And when I talk about well-being, I mean the whole child. That means mind, body, and also I will add spirit. And they are all connected to each other. When one part is not functioning so well, it impacts all of the other parts as well. You really can't separate that out. I'm especially going to focus on the impact of toxic stress on brain development and how that impacts the whole wellness of a person throughout the lifespan. One of the things that we have in common, all of us in this room and everyone, is our brains and how they develop. They were created for us to survive, and they're wired for us to survive. That helps us in many instances, but sometimes it creates problems for us as well. They're wired, the oldest part of our brain is wired to respond to perceived danger, whether it's everyday stressors, whether it's tolerable stressors or toxic stressors. And what may be a toxic stressor to one person may be more tolerable to another. So we're individuals in that way. But as these things come at us day to day and year to year, we react by the way our brains are wired to respond. And I can't remember if it was Christine or Sheila who mentioned, we've heard of the flight, fight, or freeze response, which is what we're basically from the time of earliest creation, how we respond to a danger that comes. And we tend to respond one way or the other. That floods our system with all kinds of adrenaline, makes our heartbeat race. If we're in the fight mode, our breathing increases. If we're in the fright mode, we may just really shut down, or in the flight mode may decrease some of those things. But all of these are a way to get us to respond somehow to an immediate stressor. What we've only more recently found out is that the impact of the flooding of the brain with all of these hormones and electrical impulses and everything that is going on during that time actually over time affects the whole body. So that for someone who has had a great deal of toxic stress in their life, their whole body is more affected. Their immune system, their endocrine system, their digestive system is all impacted. So a child who has had a lot of adverse childhood experiences, frequently and early in life, brain architecture is more strongly impacted than adults whose brains are already fully formed and tend to respond more readily, which is not to say adults can't also be impacted by toxic stress, hence post-traumatic stress syndrome, for example, with extreme stressor kinds of situations. But for a young child especially, whose brain is developing during the first few thousand days of life, more than at any other point in their lifetime, the impact of toxic stressors are much more severe during that period of time. So the more toxic stressors there are, the greater the impact. Research has told us over the last decade or so, not only on mental health, but also on physical health. So that someone who has had a high number of toxic stressors early in their life is more likely to have heart disease, is more likely to have diabetes, is more likely to have cancer, high blood pressure. Not only, in addition, more likely to have mental health disorders, substance use disorders, obesity, problems with obesity, more likely to smoke, more likely to use IV drugs. So there's a direct relationship between the number of toxic stressors a young person has and what happens to them over the course of their lifetime. The good news that the research is also telling us is that those toxic stressors don't have to be a person's destiny. We have also found out that the brain is very plastic and that we can counteract the impact of adverse childhood experiences with benevolent childhood experiences, or even into adulthood, learn to develop resiliency skills and relationships that help to mold that brain develop into one that is able to respond in more healthy ways and not be as severely impacted with health issues. One of the things that has found to be the most valuable for this neuroplasticity and the healing of the brain and the whole body is healthy relationships. Attachments in early childhood, but healthy relationships over time. That is the most powerful thing. So whether it's a family unit, or if the family unit isn't able to be there and provide that, it can be a caregiver, another important person in someone's life that provides the healthy relationship to help promote the healing. Other things that also help promote the healing are skills and techniques of mindfulness, mental health help where that's called for, but learning skills to take care of yourself in terms of self-care, to calm yourself, exercise, nutrition, and sleep. All of these things are healing things that are normal and part of what's available to everyone here. We also have parenting resources because we think the value of that primary relationship between a young child and family unit is so important, and whether it's a parent, whether it's a grandparent or another relative who might be helping to raise the child. We have resources here in Dare County. The most prominent is called Triple P. Triple P stands for Positive Parenting Program. Children Youth Partnership coordinates that program throughout the county. We now have 27 certified parent educators to support parents throughout the county, and they're embedded in workplaces throughout the county so that the hope is that wherever a parent may turn to help, there is someone there in that agency or organization that's readily available, and they don't have to search all over the county for where the help might be. The value also of Triple P is that it is not a one-size-fits-all program or resource. Not everybody needs the same thing, but we believe that all parents need some kind of help and support and education in raising their children. Children don't come with an instruction manual. So all parents can benefit. So our hope, as well as destigmatizing anything around getting help for mental health, is we want to destigmatize the idea that you need to get help to raise kids, because we think everybody does need that help and support. Whether it's basic information about child development, whether it's a support system for somebody else to listen, whether it's more intensive help in terms of brief one-on-ones or a group situation. Triple P has different models depending on what the parents' needs are that are identified. So if a parent would call Children Youth Partnership, for example, and talk to our family support manager, Sarah Sampson, who coordinates Triple P throughout the county, she would listen to what their concerns are, and she would advise what sort of direction they might want to go into, what level of help would be most appropriate for them. We also have Triple P available free to every parent in North Carolina online, an online program that's a basic parenting education program that parents can take advantage of 24/7, so that parents can't always get out to a meeting or a workshop, but this is something that's available for everyone as well. One of the other things that we have launched recently is an effort called Be Resilient OBX. Our aim is to work collaboratively with other groups in the county to develop a community resiliency model where the focus is not on what's wrong with you or even what happened to you, which is a trauma-informed focus, but moving to a resiliency-focused area, which is looking for the strengths and building on the strengths that we believe every person has. We're in the process of raising awareness about the impact of adverse childhood experiences and also the impact of creating benevolent childhood experiences and teaching resiliency skills throughout the community, as well as working with systems so that they can shift the culture away from that deficit model of what's wrong with you to the resiliency focus of what's right with you. On the back, you'll see some other resources that give more information about what I'm talking about tonight. And Amber's now going to talk about youth and risk and protective factors for our youth.
Thank you, Nancy. The important information that Nancy just shared ties in very well with the information that I'm about to share with you. I do want to thank you all for being here this evening. I'm honored to be here. I work for CASA. I've been with the coalition for 10 years, and our work focuses on substance use disorders and addiction. So to be able to talk about those issues under the bigger issue of mental health, it's exciting for me to be here and to be able to talk about that. I am tasked with talking about adolescent risk factors and protective factors in youth drug trends in under 10 minutes. So, I'm not sure how we're going to do that, but I'm going to try. And I know Tess really wanted to allow time for questions at the end. So please jot them down. You guys, we're all very approachable, conversational, so I'm going to try to hurry so we can have an opportunity to discuss and talk about those things. But our mission and goals at CASA, while they are not easy, they are simple. We are charged with reducing and preventing substance use disorders and addiction in the community, preventing overdose death, while on the other side promoting healthy and safe norms in our community. Youth who have access to more assets and more protective factors, not only are they going to be more successful and thrive now, but they're going to have better outcomes in the future. They're going to be less likely to engage in risky and unhealthy behavior, and they're more likely to be resilient when they do face those challenges. A lot of the information that Nancy covered. So what is an asset? What is a protective factor? It's the things, the experiences that are going to help grow our kids into healthy, safe, responsible, and caring individuals. We can look at these things from an external and an internal point of reference. I hope that you guys will take a look at the 40 developmental assets that I placed back on the back table. And when we look at assets, we look at them over the lifespan. So the assets for a 5-year-old child may be very different than what the assets, protective factors would be for our high school kids. But take a look, it's a pretty comprehensive list. I'm not saying 40 is the end-all be-all, but we work with an organization called the Search Institute, and this is some of the testing that we will be doing with our local students coming up very soon. A lot of the information, you know, we're practitioners in the field for many years. A lot of the data that we get is national, regional at best. Local data is really hard to get, but we are going to be measuring these things with our local youth. So what is an example of an asset, a protective factor? It could be family support, positive family communication, having great adult role models, creative activities, youth programs. All of those things are external. They're what we view as family relationships, how the school is impacting our kid, how the community is impacting our kid. And when we look at internal assets, we're looking at achievement, motivation. Do our children have those feelings of self-esteem, integrity? So take a look at that list. Those are what we consider to be protective factors, part of the work that we do in the world of addiction and substance abuse. It's not always based on talking about that drug or the harms or the risk or how it's going to impact that child from a health perspective and a safety perspective. We're trying to build up those resiliency skills, those protective factors in the community as well. I'm going to read you another list. Early aggressive behavior, lack of parental supervision, academic problems, undiagnosed mental health issues, peer substance use, availability of drugs, access to alcohol, poverty, peer rejection, child abuse, and child neglect. What do you think those things are? Anybody? Risk factors. That's what I look at day in and day out in the world and the arena that I work in addiction and substance abuse. Every one of those things that I just listed is a youth risk factor for many things, but specifically for substance abuse. Other individual risk factors could include genetic predisposition. We've all heard about that. Sheila touched on that. And we can also trace things back to in utero. Was that pregnancy exposed to alcohol? Was that pregnancy exposed to opioids? So we're talking about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and neonatal abstinence. Those kiddos may have some very unique challenges. So that risk may exist, something that that child cannot change, but what can we do in that instance? We can build protection. A lot of parents will ask me, so does this mean my child is going to have an addiction issue or a substance use disorder because they were exposed to a multitude of risk factors, right? That's what we think. No, the answer is absolutely no. Protection, the more assets that we can provide, not only in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our community, that lessens the risk. Talk a little bit about brain development. I know Nancy touched on that, and our drug trends. Again, these are national stats. I hope to share some more local stats by year's end. By senior year, you guys, 60% of our students will have tried alcohol. By senior year, 16% will have tried a prescription drug for non-medical purposes. It's a really technical term, non-medical purposes. You guys, it means to get high, okay? So 16% of our kids will have tried a prescription drug by senior year. By senior year, this one's alarming. Again, a national statistic, but I think this is mirrored somewhat in our community. 45% will have used marijuana. By senior year, 25 to 35% will have tried vaping. By show of hands, who knows what vaping is? Okay, most of you, the e-cigarettes, you guys, this is a trend, unfortunately an upward trend with our youth. These devices are very easily hidden. Oftentimes they don't even look like an e-cigarette. Sometimes they look like a flash drive. I've gotten a lot of feedback from our local SROs, our student resource officers, that vaping has become an issue in the school, because this is not the safe alternative to smoking. These are very dangerous products as well. Carcinogens, there's nicotine in most of the products too, so I think people have a misperception that it's a healthy alternative to smoking, and it's definitely not. Vaping and marijuana now are more popular than traditional cigarettes. I've shared this one quite often in other formats, but I think it's important, and it kind of hits home to trend and what we're talking about with youth substance use. Almost 1 million teens nationwide, this is kiddos 12 to 17, will abuse a prescription painkiller for the first time this year. Almost 1 million kids. In Dare County specifically, the drugs that parents, caregivers, teachers, grandparents should be aware of. Alcohol is number one, you guys. Alcohol is number one with our kiddos, marijuana, and prescription meds. I'm not saying that they're not using other substances, but those three should definitely be on your radar. I have a lot of parents who want to talk to me about heroin and fentanyl and carfentanil and gray death, and I'm happy to share information all day long. I'm pleased that the majority of our young people are not exposed to that or using that. Alcohol is hurting our kids more than any other drug. It is not a rite of passage. It is not a safe substance by any means for our young people to be using. And that ties in nicely. Substances are going to impact the teen brain much differently than they impact the adult brain. And a lot of times when I'm speaking with parents who host those underage drinking parties and say, hey, I took the keys, my kids are safe, I'll talk to them about brain development, because that seems to maybe hit on a different nerve. That pun was intended. Teen brains are physically different than an adult brain. So I want to use a car as a metaphor for the teenage brain. Okay, teens have a fully functioning gas pedal, right? The reward system in the brain that Nancy talked about, but really weak brakes. Okay, prefrontal cortex. Okay. This is where what happens? Reasoning, rational thought, decision making, right? Our young people are not supposed to be the best at making judgment. Physically, their brains are not developed. I think it's important for parents to know that. We've got some real smart kids that are doing trig, math analysis, smart kids, right? But from a judgment perspective, they react much more emotionally than rationally, and their brains are built to do that. So think about that undeveloped teen brain. Let's soak it with alcohol. Let's soak it with marijuana. Or let's soak it with an opioid. Very, very, very dangerous combination. Dramatic growth and development happens during those adolescent years, so it's very critically important for parents to understand that vulnerability for substance use disorders. Different drugs impact the brain differently, but one thing that they all have in common is that they raise dopamine levels. Why do people use drugs? They work, right? What is dopamine? It's that feel good, right? It's that feel good. It triggers the reward and pleasure centers in the brain. Dopamine release for teens, those everyday dopamine releasers are hanging out with your friends, listening to music, eating, playing sports. Did you guys know when you eat, dopamine is released in the brain? That's why it feels good to eat, right? So what do we want to do? We want to focus on those kind of dopamine releasers, and they're kind of low to moderate, right? So what do you think drugs do? What kind of dopamine release drugs and alcohol have on the brain? High release of dopamine, right? This is getting a little bit into how folks can become addicted, but it's really, really important for parents, caregivers, all of us to understand that brain development focus and why our kids are so at risk if substances are introduced into that developing brain. We do not want drugs and alcohol to hijack the brain, so to speak. They produce a much more euphoric effect. It's a scary process, and as some of the panel members alluded to before, could create permanent and long-term damage to the brain, organic brain damage, so to speak. So please, that's something, just a simple take home of, it's not a rite of passage. These substances impact our kids much differently than they do us as adults. Just some general, I think I'm doing pretty good on time. Some general take homes when we talk about, again, I'm in the world of, addiction and substance abuse, but the broader spectrum is mental health. Chris already, covered this, but mental health disorders among children are described as serious changes in the way kids learn, behave, or handle their emotions. So it's important for us to pay attention to what our kids are doing. Sheila said it perfectly. Early detection and then access to the right services is probably the most crucial thing for our families to know. If you or a loved one or somebody that you know is struggling with this, getting over that stigma of mental health and substance abuse and being able to identify what the problem is and get them into services. I think all of us brought some resources in the back. So if you want phone numbers, you guys, if you want emails, we've got them for you here today. Hopefully you'll have questions for us at the end. I could literally talk about this all day long. It's very, very important information. But thank you all. I'm going to hand it over to Michelle, who does great work on the treatment end. Thank you all.
Hi, my name is Michelle Hawbaker. I'm a licensed professional counselor supervisor, and I'm a licensed clinical addiction specialist. And I'm going to try and talk to you a little bit tonight about when to get help, and if you do want to get help, how you go about that process. I can't start this conversation without at least reinforcing what Sheila and Dr. Petzing have said and talking about the stigma that's out there. It's very real, and unfortunately, it delays treatment quite often, and mental health issues are just like any other disorder. The earlier you intervene, the better. I hope if you get nothing else from this, from the video, from Sheila, from the numbers that Dr. Petzing gave you, is this is so common. Mental health problems are so common with males, with females, with children. It's an unfortunate that there's a layer of secrecy over it because it is so common and it's a secret that's damaging. It's damaging to our society. So, when do you get help? It can be a really hard thing to figure out. So I'm just going to give you a general rule for when to get help. If there is a symptom that you or your child are experiencing and it is causing them not to be able to function in some way, shape, or form, they're not getting to school on time, you're having trouble getting to work, you're having difficulty accomplishing your daily tasks, and if this problem has persisted for at least 2 weeks, 2 to 4 weeks, it's probably time to go talk to someone about that. That's not normal to not be able to do something that you need to do to get your life done, for 2 to 4 weeks. So it's a good time to go talk to somebody about that. So okay, so you convince yourself you need help. Where do you go? It can be a really tough decision to make. It's never a wrong idea to start with your primary care physician. routinely, when I look at information about what primary care physicians are treating, in the top 10 reasons is always depression and anxiety. It's always there. They treat it routinely. They're usually well versed in the treatment of those disorders. It's not a bad place to start, especially if you have that trusting relationship. Now locally, if you have insurance, I hate to tell you this, but probably the right thing to do is to turn the card over and call the phone number on the back and ask them who your in-network providers are. And I apologize for telling you you should do that at first. If you're computer savvy, you might be able to figure it out on their website. But you know, this treatment, it can be expensive, and you want to go with somebody that you're paying for insurance, and you should go to the person that your insurance is covering. Usually there's a list of options. You go to the website, put in mental health, or call the benefits people and ask them who they cover. And you'll be surprised to know that even though supposedly there was a parity law that passed some time ago in the federal government, that mental health coverage will be different than your physical coverage. There might be a different copay, there might be some limits to the amount you can go. There's differences. You should check that out. That's if you have insurance. Now, if you don't have insurance locally, one of the things that you can do is called Trillium Health Resources. They manage the money that the state provides for people without insurance. And our state provides money for people without insurance, so that's outstanding. You can get mental health treatment if you don't have insurance. You have to go to the provider that's approved. Port Health Services is one of them, and you can go to an unlimited psychiatry visits, and you can go to 24 therapy visits. And if you need more therapy visits, we do have to fill out a piece of paper, but it's okay. It's not that terrible, and we get that done also. Here in Dare County, Port Health is the biggest provider of those services. I believe integrated family services also, but Trillium Health has an exhaustive list of them on their website, or you can call their access line. If you don't have to stay in Dare County if you're uninsured and you want to seek mental health services. You can go to any of the 24 counties in their catchment area. For some reason you don't want to go in your home community. It's an option. What will happen? Generally, you're going to, if you get, I'm biased. I'm a therapist. I'd recommend you start with a licensed therapist. They're well trained to do it. They're going to ask you a ton of questions. They're going to tell you what they think is going on with you and what they think will help. Now, most of the time, the best practice is to do a combination of therapy and possibly medication later if that's not effective. That's common. They should be able to give you an idea of what they think is going on with you. They should be able to give you an idea of how it would be treated, how long it would take. Now, one thing I would just clearly like to advise is if you go and you talk to any medical professional, but certainly a therapist, if you don't feel comfortable, go find another one. It's fine. It is absolutely okay. At Port Health, I have 10 therapists. Purposefully, we have people with very different personalities, they use different modes of treatment. It's okay. It's okay. Find somebody else, get a recommendation. You're not going to hurt anybody's feelings. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. If you don't feel comfortable, you need to be comfortable in that relationship. You can find somebody else. That is for routine situations. I would be remiss if I didn't take a minute at least to talk about emergencies. We are very fortunate in our state to have a service provider for emergency situations. If you ever feel that yourself or somebody that you're concerned with is having feelings of suicide, extreme depression, anger outbursts, talking about hurting someone else, that's not something you can talk to your primary care physician about or wait to call Port on Monday morning. That's something that's going to require some immediate attention. Now, fortunately, if there's one thing I could make you do, go to that back table and pick up these cards. There's a service in our county available called Mobile Crisis Team, and it's run through an agency called Integrated Family Services, and I can't speak highly enough about them. They're available 24/7. If you are experiencing, or someone you love are experiencing a substance abuse, mental health, or developmental disabilities crisis, pick up the phone, call these people. With your permission, they will come to where you are. They will come to your house, they will come to the 7-Eleven parking lot, they will come to wherever you are to intervene and help figure out what needs to be done in that situation. It's free of charge. It's a free service provided by the state of North Carolina, and they're outstanding individuals. Just to make the statement though, if you are concerned, if you do have somebody in your life that has depression, or you're concerned about a child, is it normal, is it not normal? You know, you can Google the list of potential symptoms, potential signs and symptoms of someone that's contemplating suicide, and there's a boatload of them. From hopelessness, helplessness, giving things away, withdrawing from family or friends. But look, if you have somebody in your life that's depressed and you're concerned about, somebody's going to have to ask the question. Somebody's going to have to reach out to them and say, you know, you look like you're hurting right now. You know, have you ever thought of taking your own life? Have you ever felt like life is not living? And that's not something that's really comfortable to do for everybody, and that's all right. And if you're in that situation, reach out. Call these people. They'll come to your door, you know, and help you do that. Ask the question. Sometimes you'd be surprised at the answer. You can gain all kinds of information. There are, I think that's it. I think that's what I got. There are resources. I would be happy if you ever get stuck, you know, you're more than happy to call Port Health Services, and we will guide you if you're not appropriate for our care. We have a tremendously talented group of clinicians in this community that we can refer to. But again, you're not alone. Seek help. Ask for some help if you're not sure what to do. There's people here to help you.
Michelle, and you may have said that the mobile crisis line is 24.
It's 24/7, and if we have any business owners here, there are some posters in the back. If there happens to be an employee place or any place or even a public place, you can post that. Please feel free to take one.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to open the floor for questions. Anybody have any questions or comments? John? And you may address it to the group or to an individual, whichever you prefer.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. I heard a lot of talk about connection between mental health disorder and substance abuse. Are there any connections between stimulants that children take? I'm thinking about kids who are prescribed Ritalin at a young age, kind of become dependent on that, and then once they become adults, they can transition to Adderall or other stimulants they may take. Does long-term stimulant use affect have any issues or interactions with mental health?
No, I'm not aware specifically of any direct connections that have been made with that. We certainly do know that Ritalin, Adderall, those kinds of medications have become more drugs of abuse, particularly, you know, they are common, as you know, commonly prescribed, and then particularly as young adults go to college, I think that they've become much more readily available. Probably, you know, either, you know, prescriptions to one, but then, you know, there's a market among other students, you know, and there's a multitude of reasons. Some of that is pressure to succeed, and you know, probably if you were to poll a lot of young folks and find out from their parents, that, or, you know, their parents may be even the impetus behind some of those individuals getting those prescriptions, because they want, you know, their child to be most successful. But to my knowledge, there's not been any direct connection found there. So.
I think one of the things that you may be interested that we have found is that we're really reevaluating the way that we're treating kids, in that we've learned so much about trauma, a lot, you know, what Nancy was referring to through the ACEs, but there's been a lot of misdiagnosis of ADHD, when actually it was adverse childhood experiences or trauma that's the foundation for the behavior. So that's really been a movement in our field the last 5 to 10 years to really, hopefully, therapists can get their hands on these kids and evaluate them and see if their behavior is actually attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is primarily a neurological brain disorder, or whether it could be based in trauma. And if it is based on trauma, go ahead and get them in treatment, effective treatment early. So there's been a lot of information on that. It's
I think it's important not to over amplify a problem. We want to have very correct, valid data. The CDC report on children aged 3 to 17 that have a diagnosis of ADHD is 6.8% of that population. So I think we hear so much about ADHD, and it is a very, serious concern that appropriate treatment, but we're hearing a lot more about it. Michelle touched on overdiagnosis. That is normally diagnosed well before you're in college. So college students are not all of a sudden getting ADHD, okay? A lot of parents have called me, actually 4 over the last year that said, is it okay? My kids are really putting pressure on me to get a prescription for Adderall. And I said, they need to take more time to study. It's something that should have been tracked or seen probably much earlier. I know we're going a little bit different than your question, John, but I think it's important just to be specific in what information is correct and not over or underestimate those issues.
Nancy, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback, if everybody's making the same point I would also recommend to you, if there is one book you should read, it is called The Deepest Well, and it is by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. It is a fascinating and very readable book that explains this connection between adverse childhood experiences and health over the lifespan. But she makes the point that very often it's a child presenting with some kind of learning problem, and a parent coming in or a teacher saying, this child has ADHD and should be prescribed. And she, as a pediatrician, has found, that no, in most cases, it's something else. The behaviors that are being seen are symptomatic of this other underlying problem. But I would recommend that book. It's just a fascinating read. If I could wave a magic wand, it would be that everybody in the community would read that book.
John, I will say in the same line, you asked specifically about stimulant use early on, kind of laying a pathway for abuse later. I haven't seen that research with stimulants, but we are hearing with opioids that can have a pretty dramatic impact with young people. Opioids prescribed to children, even in a short-acting time, a week to 2 weeks, could lay some groundwork, those pathways that lead into addiction. We're trying to get Dr. Blake Fagan, who's a physician who speaks to that new research, where the research is new. We've been tracking the opioid trend for going into 2 decades, but how that impacts young people hasn't been studied to any great detail. But we're hearing things from our medical providers, people in the know, that opioids, we could see pathways laid for addiction for children. Would you add anything to that, Chris?
No, that's absolutely the case. So, and again, just as Amber said, in as little as 1 to 2 weeks, and often we'll see that in the case of a sports injury. And just as Sheila had mentioned, a young person who, through the course of their sport has an ACL injury or something like that, maybe goes on to surgery and rehab and then gets placed on some narcotic prescription for a period of time. Those, and again, not all, but some can certainly be at risk for the development of addiction, and it can happen in a very short period of time. Goes back to the developing brain, and that during that period of time, the brain is malleable and can easily be influenced in a way that lays that groundwork.
So I would just add to that, for parents or grandparents, if you have any kind of influence, it's important that parents be the gatekeepers for their kids about prescription medications. It is real easy to rely on the expertise of doctors, and not all doctors have the same philosophy. It has really changed over time, but there's still education happening for medical providers about the importance of how prescribing is done, particularly for younger children. You know, we've been prescribing all kinds of stuff. We don't know the long-range impact on a child's brain with many of these prescriptions. So it's important for parents not just to assume, well, a doctor prescribed it, it must be okay. The role of a parent is to ask hard questions. Why are you prescribing this drug? How long does my child really need to be on it? If my child starts to feel better after 3 days, do they need to take the whole course of all the drugs you gave? That's the role of a parent, to ask those hard questions and to make sure you understand why those drugs are being prescribed.
Thank you, Nancy. We have another question.
Good evening. My name is Leila Harper, and I'm an English as a second language teacher and Spanish teacher in Manteo. And Ms. Griffin, you had mentioned that one of the great things about the brain is that it is malleable. And in addition to healthy relationships, you said that mindfulness techniques and practices are shown to be healing for the brain. And I'm wondering if anywhere in Dare County currently there are any mindfulness programs happening or the thought of them happening.
Actually, yes, one of our board members is very passionate about mindfulness and connecting with some other mindfulness and yoga instructors about developing programs and also some fundraising to make mindfulness more available to more of our young people as a learned technique. Some people may misunderstand and think mindfulness has something to do with religion. It does not. It's not a religious brainwashing kind of a thing. It's a way to learn how to calm yourself, and when you're feeling stressed, a way to focus and be more functional. But school systems in other parts of the country, instead of sending kids to detention or timeout, send them to a mindfulness place where they've calmed down, and when they're calmed down, they can go back to class.
And that's a board member at the Children and Youth Partnership, or what?
Yes,
Okay,
yeah.
cool. Thank you.
Either one of you, come right ahead, and if you can come here or you can stay at your place, whichever's most comfortable.
I have not been involved with the educational system with education for a very long time. I've been retired from being a teacher. But I can remember years ago that brain development in children kind of happened every 2 years. The brain develops in a 2-year period, like 5th and 6th grade. Their brains are developing, more intellectual stuff is going on with them. 7th and 8th grade, they're focusing more on emotional development, and the brain is not developing as much, but that it was like an every 2-year thing, and that was very helpful to parents at that time. Is that still kind of what's going on, or has that changed?
It really has changed somewhat, and there's some wonderful literature out there about it, but what we've learned in the brain research is the largest explosion of brain development happens in the first 3 years of life. Then there's some other important brain development that happens in the next couple of years, but those first 5 years of life are when most of the connections are made. There's really a very quiet period in terms of brain development during the elementary school years and early middle school years, and then during the adolescent years. And I want to say, from a brain development perspective, adolescence kind of goes from age 15 to age 25. So the car insurance folks figured out a long time ago that brains aren't really fully developed until about age 25, hence the way they structure insurance rates. But so another phase of brain development happens between those ages, adolescence, more broadly speaking than that. And that's when impulse control begins to really happen, when executive function solidifies more, some beginnings of executive function and decision-making happen and self-regulated behavior happens earlier, but really it comes into play much more, during those teen years, but not till the end of those teen years do we really see. So when you say a teenager should know better, maybe on some level they know better, but in terms of being able to have self-control at all times, not good decision-making or judgment.
Thank you.
I'm gonna intercede real quick before the next question. Rosie, Shirley, are y'all still doing mindfulness work out of your practice? The teacher in the back, the question, we've got a resource list in the back. These ladies right here, Shirley and Rosie, Shirley Parker and Rosie Rankin, are local clinicians that focus in that area specifically. So we've got a lot of different providers who may be able to help you on that.
I too want to address school situation. And I'm like Fran, I've been retired for quite a while now. But as a school counselor in Northern Virginia, I had a lot of resources at my hand, even in elementary school, so I knew where to refer. And I do think the schools are where it's at. That's where the teens, if you have good relationships with the counselors or adult teachers, all teachers are adults, but that's the best source to get some resources out there. So Nancy, I know you used to be in charge of all the counselors. I just wonder if the last two presenters, have you done work with the school counselors so that they have these resources at hand?
We were fortunate, 4 years ago, we were able to place licensed counselors in just about every Dare County school. There's only 2 that do not have a licensed counselor, and it has, the result of that has been 150 new children have entered into services. The counselors that I have available in the school, we target children whose families either wouldn't be able to or aren't willing to take them to therapy. So and what's happened is in the schools that it's created wonderful partnerships between the counselors in the schools. So they've had stuff. Now there's 2 schools we haven't been able to serve just because of numbers, Nags Head Elementary and Kitty Hawk Elementary, and we're working on that. But there are, even with those additional 150 children being served in the school, we still are at a deficit as far as having child-trained clinicians available for our children. But I think that was very helpful for the school counselors to be made aware, to have a resource right there available for them in the school that they can talk to regularly.
Absolutely. People may not realize school counselors are not trained mental health clinicians. They are developmentalists, and they're trained to promote healthy development. But when they recognize and see a child who needs clinical help, then they need to have other resources to work with.
I'd like to add, I mentioned the Breaking Through Task Force and the parent survey, but prior to conducting the parent survey back at the end of last year, we conducted a survey of school personnel, and so it was teachers, bus drivers, anyone who would take the time to complete the survey, and we received just over a couple hundred surveys. And that survey was geared to, or was focused on what resources do school personnel need, what additional supports do they need. And basically this task force will be looking at the responses that they receive from the school and community personnel that also work with youth, and matching those with the responses from the families and where these align, seeing where we're going to focus our priorities. It was interesting with the responses from the school and community personnel that work with youth. There definitely needs to be increased education about those resources. So whether the task force, one initiative that may come out of that is creating quick resource guides for where are the different referral sources, how can you make those referrals. We're fortunate in Dare County, it's unlike a lot of the counties in North Carolina, that we have a school nurse in every school. They happen to be public health nurses, but one of the things that we realized a shortcoming is, they interact with so many of our children.
Yep.
they also can be another set of eyes and ears to recognize an issue, but we haven't adequately given them the resources they need for making a referral as well. So that's another thing that we'll be looking at through this task force of how to do that in a more effective way than we have been.
I believe Susan Merrill had a question.
Yeah, Amber, more a comment than a question. My younger child is 20, so I haven't been out of the high school scene for too long. I find the 60% of high school seniors saying they've dabbled in alcohol, I find that stunningly low. My kids were both pretty dorky, you know, I would say on the dorkier end of high schoolers. And just from talking to them, I think, and I don't know how that, you know, would change how things are addressed, but I find 60% to be. And is that a self-reported or?
Data is only as good as that source, so it's hard to talk in any kind of youth behavior in a really specific number, so oftentimes I kind of shy away from that. I shared that statistic today because it comes from NIDA, which is the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and they are phenomenal. They're sound folks, they're not just researchers, they're scientists. So that comes from the Monitoring the Future survey, which they've done for decades and decades. The sample size is huge. So it's a pretty good indicator, 60% by senior year, when you're thinking about the entire population. Of course, some populations are going to be much higher. Some of the data sets that I've looked at are by seniors, 70%. Now, our freshman population is much lower. When you see prevalence rates among our freshmen to seniors, it's vastly different. So I hear what you're saying because I hear it from the kids a lot too. And
Well, that's what
everybody
I'm kinda curious
drinks.
about, is
Everybody drinks is what I hear on a very regular basis. I have to push back on it because it propels a misperception. When things are more common, they're what? More acceptable, right? So while I share that number is very high with our senior population, it's pretty low with our freshmen. So we want to be clear cut of really where the data is. Everybody is not drinking. The majority of kids are not abusing substances, but we get into a mindset of buying into it a lot because we see it rampantly on social media now. Technology is a blessing and a burden, in my opinion, but what the kids are seeing are the alcohol drinking parties, the marijuana parties, the prescription pill parties, and I do think there is a misperception with our young people that use is higher than it actually is. So the only thing I can say is data is only as good as the source. A lot of the different sources that I look at will put that age range around 60 to 70%. They are self-reported. I often hear people say, well, kids are going to lie, right? Not every kid is going to be truthful in a survey, but there's mechanisms to kick out, you know, those surveys if they haven't answered consistently. And when we look at kids across communities that have those same general trends and numbers, then we tend to think, okay, we're somewhere hitting the mark. So I absolutely hear what you're saying in terms of it may be an underrepresentation somewhat. But that number comes from NIDA, 70% through other sources. But I think it's important for sometimes us to push back on really knowing what the data is and not perpetuating that everybody's using. A lot of kids have that mindset because that's their individual experience.
And I think a second part of my comment too was, I think that's a really good piece of information to get out with parents who think it's okay, you know, I took their keys away, so it's okay to, you know, give them a basement full of beer. I think that's a really good image to put out there. It's, okay, you may not worry about them driving, but let's think about this brain development.
The brain development thing is an easy kind of comeback for me as a person in the field. You can't really dispute it, right? It's the science. The other thing that we can come back with is, okay, you took the keys. Are we only concerned about road safety, right? What about sexual assault, injuries, drowning, falling off a deck? I mean, there's a lot of other things that can happen, and not only are you giving a child underage the okay to do something illegal, which is a whole other myriad of issues. It's illegal to drink under 21. So, and to give that open door, I just think is a very damaging thing for parents to do. But great comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Linda Palumbo.
I'm a former principal, so I can probably talk from here without the mic, we'll be on. Several things that you said this evening really kind of hit me in terms of speaking about prior to age 14. The problems that you begin to be able to identify. I think you said, Sheila, it may have been you, that half of the cases of mental illness, or Christine, you could identify age 14 or younger. And then the comment that was made, and Nancy, I think it was you, that the biggest maturity period is that 15 to 25 age group. What all that says to me is that we need to be focusing on younger children. And I think we do a lot at the middle school and high school levels, at least in my experience. That's when we kind of, get into the thing of preventing drinking, even though we've had all of the, the elementary, the DARE programs and that type of thing. So I was wondering, what are we doing in Dare County to focus more on mental health issues of children who are either elementary or lower middle school ages?
Nancy, I think that's where the.
We're all looking at Nancy.
There's a lot, there are some things going on, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. And I'm sharing my biases here, I have to say. I retired from the school system after 29 years, and I'm now in doing this work that I think is more prevention focused. The school system, and I understand all the reasons why, has been extremely focused on the academic needs of students over the last many years, and has not attended in a balanced kind of a way to the needs of the whole child, including the social emotional learning piece. For worry that we don't have enough time to do that because we gotta cover this curriculum in time for the test. And I get that pressure and I understand it and I'm sympathetic with it. However, if kids are in social emotional distress, they aren't going to be able to learn anyway. So time would be better spent dealing with and teaching those skills of resiliency and social emotional, dealing with social emotional issues, along with, yes, the academic skills, but it shouldn't be either or, it needs to be both in. So one of the things that we'll be doing with this Be Resilient OBX is working closely with the school system in terms of developing a structure and some skills, first of all, to help teachers learn how to foster resilient classrooms. The other thing, again, a bias of mine, imagine if 64%, and that's what the research says, of adults have at least one adverse childhood experience. How many teachers do you suppose have adverse childhood experiences of their own that may or may not have been dealt with? And that's not faulting them, I'm just saying it's a reality. So unless we're also taking care of our adult population, and specifically in terms of schools, our administrators too, and our teachers, so that they first are learning how to be resilient themselves and to function in the okay zone without flipping out into the high or the low zone, so that they can then create resilient classroom environments for all students and not feel like they gotta send a couple of students out of the classroom so that the rest can learn. Those are the kinds of things that we need to work on and do. We have sent a team of folks to other places in the state to find out what's happening there. We're kind of behind in terms of things that are happening in other parts of the state, but to learn from them, we don't feel like we have to reinvent the wheel, but to learn from them and then come back and work in our community to shape across systems. But the court system is another one that needs to be more of a resiliency focused area, but we're excited about the possibilities of working with our school system. But there's work to be done, certainly.
Gentleman's next.
Okay. My name is Don Leggett. I live in Avon, and actually I had a visit with court today with Ann. she's my counselor.
Awesome, I hope it was awesome.
Yeah, well, we do, okay. The reason I came here is because there's a lot of times what happens with mental health issues and situations and stuff like that, what you hear from is you hear from the maze keepers, okay, but you don't hear from the rat in the maze. I'm the rat in the maze, okay? I've had depression for over 28 years. I've been hospitalized over 5 times. I've had shock treatments. I've been on medication for a long time. I've been off medication for a long time. I've called the police. I've called the suicide hotline. Mobile Crisis Center is the best thing in the world. If you're ever in a situation, they've been out to my house twice. And the thing that they do that a lot of places haven't done is, there's one gal by the name of Elizabeth, and she followed up. And it's like, when you call a suicide hotline, that's it. They think they may say, okay, yeah, you need to have the police come out and visit you, but then that's it. What Elizabeth did is, she called me the next day. How are you doing? Are you doing okay? I know we settled some things and we got some things in place, but how are you doing today? And it's even gotten to the point where I have a couple of police, because the police have been out to my house 3 or 4 times. I hate to say how many. That's why I said, if you got questions about mental health, trust me, I've done it, been there, got the t-shirt, and I have the papers to prove it, okay? And like today, it was yesterday, I think I had a really bad day, and I asked one of the policemen who's been out to my house before to come out, and he came to my front door, and he caught him totally off surprise. I just gave him a big hug and started crying, and he was just there for me. So, you know, my hat's off to the Dare County and all the emergency people and the people that are dealing with mental health, because they are doing. I'm also from, I have a place I grew up in Roxborough, and it's nothing like what happens out here. There's more care out here than there has been anywhere, okay? Now, the thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is that about 9 years ago, I was reading a bunch of articles about teen suicides, and I recognized that kids were taking their lives because they didn't know all the things that I knew about depression and about the disease. And so I wrote a paper that was supposed to be a presentation for high school kids. And I showed it to some teachers, and the teachers looked at me and said, you need to publish this. So I did. I published a book. It's called My Side of Depression. I'm not here to sell that. But what happened was, I actually went into, I had a friend of a friend who has a teacher that was, they did health in the middle school, okay? And she invited me in for a day where I taught to 5 middle school classes. There were 6th, 7th, and 8th grade kids. I taught 85 kids that day, an hour of class. And what happened was, they were so enthralled with what I talked about. They couldn't get the information that I told them anywhere else. And because they were still talking about it, the teacher said, if you want to write a thank you note to this guy, put it on a piece of paper. We got school thank you notes. Write it down, seal it in an envelope, give it to me, and I'll put it in an envelope and send it to them. So about a week after I made the presentation, I had 85 thank you notes from these kids. Now, here's the thing, and this is what blew me away. 3 of the kids told me they were considering suicide while I was talking to them. Middle school kids, considering suicide. One of them had attempted suicide. Another one had a parent that they didn't know what to do because they were severely depressed and didn't know where to go or what to do. And after my talk with them, they said, I know what to do. I told my mom's going to go get help. They know where to go and all so and so forth, that type of thing. Well, the point being is, the problem does start in middle school. It actually starts a little bit before that. But what I've been advocating for, and I can't do, is I've tried to go into other schools. As a matter of fact, the teacher that I taught those kids was fired because I was brought in to teach those kids. And if I talked about suicide or depression, and there was a lawsuit because somebody actually did commit suicide, the school felt that they would be held liable. And so we're not going to let this come into our school. So for 9 years, I have been trying my darndest to find psychologists, psychiatrists, and doctors of education to put together a certifiable education program that can be downloaded, put on DVDs or whatever you want to call it, submitted to schools where they don't have to worry about liability, and it could be presented in a realistic and a good way, a balanced way that's going to be safe to these kids. Because these kids, and then the other thing that really blew me away was these little kids, I'd get these notes with these, face and smiley faces and stuff like that. You have to see these handwritten notes to really believe it. It'd be, thank you for telling this, thank you again. Oh, I just had to tell you thank you. Now, in a short little paragraph, I was told thank you 3 different times. So you can tell how much that meant to these kids. And like I tell people, you know, you gotta weed the garden before you plant it. And these kids that have these emotional problems, you can't teach them. They need to clear their minds. Well, if this is happening down in the middle school, all I'm saying is, why can't we get a program? And we gotta get rid of this thing with this liability issue. My further thing on this is I just say, look, here's the deal. We teach driver's education so that kids don't get killed in cars, but they still go out and get killed in cars. Okay, they know not to drink and drive because we show them that. We show them what the cars look like. But does anybody come back and sue the school because we taught them that? No. But in mental health, for some reason, our principals and our congressmen and our politicians don't understand. They're the ones with the stigma problem. They're the ones that don't want this brought into the schools. The kids understand it. The kids want it. But what's happening is the schools are not allowing it in because that liability. We've got to turn that around. We've got to allow the education that these kids want and need in the middle, you know, in the middle school level of their students. So anything, I just wanted to be here as the rat. So if you all have any questions about mental health and mental health treatments and so on and so forth, if it hasn't been done, I haven't done, you know, type of the thing. So anyways, just, I'm here.
Thank you for
Oh,
sharing.
one other thing, real quick. If you know about it, there's an organization called Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance. Do you guys know about this? It's Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance. What they do is they advocate for peer groups. They help train a peer group organizer, so you can, if you wanted to do a nonprofit peer group, they would help you set it up, and they would train you to be a leader. And of all my experiences in the hospitals, no offense to the doctors up here and counselors and so on and so forth, I got more help from the fellow patients in the hospital. And I was doing peer group with the VA. I'm also VA, so I use the VA system. So if you want to know anything about the VA, I can tell you how broken that is. My peer group that I did on a weekly basis with the VA was probably one of the best things I ever did. And all the people got very close. And as I tell people, you really need to be, if you don't have depression or you're not there, it's hard to be understood. Okay, it really is. But people that have it know others that have it, and they know what you're talking about. And the compassion and everything else is real. So some of my best therapy has been free. Okay? But I gotta tell you, for the group out here, Dare County has done just a fantastic job. I want to say hands off to you. And if you ever want to see, this is my book. It's called My Side of Depression. And what it is, it's the high school presentation that I did. It's a real short 45-minute read. So, and I'm not selling them tonight, just so you know.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing tonight with us. Are there any other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
Can I just stand here?
Certainly.
Okay. My name is Brian Bailey. I am the mother of 3 children here in Dare County. I have a daughter at high school. I have a 5th grader at the elementary school, and I have a 10-year-old that's at home. I can relate to what Sheila said because my 10-year-old is at home because he was bullied at school because he had speech problems. He now has anxiety issues, and not only does he have a hard time leaving the house, he refuses to go into his school building. I have some serious concerns because I don't want to diminish the use of drugs and alcohol in our children. I have major concern about their use with technology and the cause and effects that is now having on them. And I'm also concerned because I really want to know what the answer to the why. Why in the last 30 years, and I think 50 years is too far, but why in the last 30 years have we seen this uptick in killings, mainly in our male population? Why are our boys feeling that for whatever reason the answer to whatever is going on in their life is to go out and cause such harm to a large number of people or even a small group of people? What has changed in our society to
make them think that that is, a just response to, what they're dealing with. And it's just in the last 30 to 50 years. So something has changed, and if we can answer that why, I think then we can start addressing it. But we've also seen considerable uptick in suicides in our kids, which I believe is linked to technology use. But, and like I said, I don't want to diminish their use of drugs and alcohol, but I haven't heard anything about technology use. And as the studies start to roll out with iPhone use and technology use and the symptoms of that, I really think that in order to save our kids, we need to start addressing that.
Talk to me later.
And another thought, and I think I lost it, but, I'm going to share a story. My daughter and I went up to the mall in Virginia, and we went to Red Robin, and we had dinner there. And I haven't had dinner there in a long, long time. But as we went in and we sat down at the table, I realized that the restaurant had provided computers to entertain either you or your child while you're sitting there at dinner. But as Kira and I talked, what we realized was that there wasn't a single table in the restaurant where there wasn't an infant in a high chair that wasn't using some form of technology, or there wasn't an adult at that same table or an alternative table that wasn't using some level of technology. And I think if we're not addressing that, then we're missing the mark. So, and it's new. I mean, nobody knows what to do with it. Nobody knows how to handle it. We're just now seeing the results of it. But if we don't jump on it now, then we're way, way, way behind the ball.
Can I say something about that, real quick? Sure. Okay, what I've found through all the people that I've dealt with that have depression or things like that is, I found that it's a moral injustice that you can't deal with. In other words, something happened to you that you wouldn't do to anybody else. Okay, that's what sets off, and there's a limit to what you can handle. So that's why it's different for different people. But it's a moral injustice that you perceive you can't get away from that really sets off the depression. So when you take a look at that, how can you develop a moral injustice in another person? A lot of it is done verbally, through communication. Okay. So basically, like bullying is the common technique. But you can talk about things and tell things, and I could go into a lot of different stuff like psychology of women's sports because I used to be a coach for gymnastics a long time ago. But with the advent of technology today, we can spread that word. 30 years ago, if you were living on the farm or something like that, you could only bully 1 or 2 or 3 people in a small area. Now we can spread that across so fast, so far, so quick. In one tweet, we can effectively affect 1 million people. Okay. And so if it's a moral injustice, and what I mean by that is it's like you have your moral values, this is what I live by, but the world is causing me or physically making me live by a different set of moral standards. And I can't live in those standards, and my mind, my subconscious mind is fighting. And that sets up the depression in the mind, and and that's where the suicide and the hate, because depression part of depression is anger. It's just part of the disease, it's a symptom. And it's one of those things where the anger, actually you get angry at yourself for being angry because you shouldn't be angry for anything, except for the sickness makes it that way. And it builds, and that's where the violence comes into play. It's an uncontrollable violence that just happens. And so, and the other thing I like to tell people is like these suicides and mass murders and things like that. People always say, well, why did they do it? Their mind was broken. Pure and simple. There's no logic. The mind's not logical right now. It's broken. And the other thing is what can prevent it. I also tell people, like, if you understand what vertigo is a disease that if you're in it and somebody tries to explain it to you, you won't believe them. Depression and mental health systems are exactly the same thing. You need to learn about it while you're healthy and while your mind is healthy, so that when you enter into the disease, you have tools, real tools that you've learned back in middle school and earlier that you can go back to actually get you through the situation. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and if I can add to that, I just recently in the last 9 months have learned how to use social media. I have been firm in my belief that it's a tool if it's used that way, the same way a hammer is used, but it's not used that way. And as I walked through learning how to use it, and ironically my kids threw a fit and they fired off all of the reasons why it is that I shouldn't be getting social media accounts, because that's what I've been telling them, for as long as I've had to tell them that. But I have found myself in countless situations where if my morals did not intervene, I would very easily find myself in a situation where I would say stuff or I would do stuff, and I may possibly have. I mean, there's been times where, I type something and I delete it and I walk away, or, I type something and I send it, and then, hopefully, I don't know, deal with the consequences later, but have since probably September of last year found myself in several situations where morally I feel conflicted because I feel this draw because I'm safe. I'm sitting behind my computer, I'm sitting behind my phone, and that's what our kids are encountering right now. It has been an incredible experience over the last couple months. And if we think about how kids think and their lack of self-control and everything that you've described in, how they grow up and how the brain is formed, that's what they're encountering. So me at 40 years old am sitting here and feeling that conflict with the, what I've learned and what I've experienced and, being an adult. But then a 15-year-old is then doing the same thing, and they are going to destroy their lives. And maybe that's an exaggeration, but I don't think it is. And we can see that it's already happening. The risk in them not being able to get jobs, or not being able to maintain jobs, or not being able to focus on their jobs. This is a thing. And I am grateful that I've had the experience that I've had over the last couple months. And I'll tell you, I want to get off of it. I want to close my account. And I am so, I feel guilty and I feel so afraid because I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, because I don't want to unfriend anybody. But that's what our kids are doing right now. And so it's not just the access to things that we don't want them to see. And now I can restrict the technology use with my own children. But then they can go into school, or they can go to an event, or, and they can sit with a friend and they can be shown something. That happened to my daughter in middle school. She didn't have a cell phone, but someone else was doing something and turned the picture around. Before you know it, I'm having that conversation, with my child that I don't want to have yet.
Sheila, I just wanted to jump in. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm sorry that your child's gone through that through the school system, and hopefully there can be some more resources to rectify that. But in terms of the technology piece, May 24th, we're hosting another similar event to this, but more focused on parent resources. And one of those segments, Kelly Nettman from the health department is going to be speaking specifically to technology. I don't know if it's going to cover all of the facets that you're talking about in terms of addiction to technology, but certainly getting parents up to speed on learning things that they may need to know, because most kids have just grown up with an iPhone in their hand. Online bullying, of course, has escalated dramatically, unfortunately, over the years. It's much easier to sit behind a screen or an iPad and say terrible things than it is face to face. So I hear what you're saying. I am not an expert at all in addiction to technology. I think we all are trying to learn more. The social competencies, I think, are going down with children with the screen time. So I hear what you're saying, but May 24th, you guys may want to come out to that event. There will be a specific piece on helping parents with resources on technology. Certainly, I think we need to do better on addiction to technology too. So,
A great resource you can access right away is online. As you say, there's some benefits, some good and some bad with technology. But a mother and pediatrician who has a lot of the same concerns that you do has developed a website called screenagers.com that is a wealth of information geared towards parents about helping them understand how to deal with this issue. There's also a lot of research on there about the impact on mental health of technology and how some applications have more severe impacts than others. You can find a lot of great information. She does a Tuesdays weekly blog for parents about specific tips and on topics that are archived, so you can go and see what you might want to find out before May 24th, and then come to the May 24th meeting.
Can I just have a quick comment about, and this is a personal observation, it has no data behind it, but I was scrolling through Facebook last week, again, just looking at different things, and there's a lot of fairly innocuous appearing posts, live with intention, choose happiness. These are all things that, on the surface sound great. But if you're somebody who does suffer from mental illness, particularly depression or anxiety, and you see things like that, those things tend to make you, or me, feel like I'm somehow inadequate because I don't feel like I can live with intention, or I can't choose happiness. It's just not that easy. So, even things like that, I think, while on the surface might appear completely benign, it have implication. So there is just so much to that is really difficult to fully fathom, I think, at the time when, we might be making a post that we think is just, very innocent and again, well-meaning, but may have some different implications for others.
Right. Well, and I believe in a ripple effect, and so for curiosity's sake, if everyone in the room goes home and Googles, drug addiction signs and symptoms, or you can specifically Google technology addiction, signs and symptoms, but a couple are, I'm going to go about this gently, but I want people to understand the impact that it's making, because it's starting with us. And if I can't put my phone down and walk away from it, that's a sign that I have an addiction. If I'm checking it multiple times, and even if I'm not coming across anything, that's signs of an addiction. If I can't go to the bathroom without taking it with me, those are signs of an addiction. Something that was incredibly sobering to me was when my daughter had done something and I felt an equal response was to take, she now has a cell phone, which I regret. But really, and it's because I can't go and get her a normal phone. They're not available. And if they are, I have to pay twice as much. So that's a whole nother issue. But when I took her phone from her, she had an addiction response. She lost her mind. And as I stood there and I watched her, I realized what it was that I was dealing with. And so now she goes through an intensive moderation, learning how to, have it, but use it as a tool and deal with it, because it's releasing dopamine in the brain, it's interacting with the, what you said, the frontal part of the brain. It is doing everything that cocaine would be doing if you were allowing your 15-year-old child or your toddler to use cocaine. And, I've already said it, but it's something that we do.
Thank you. But one thing you said, and we'll close it down though, but when you were talking a while ago about being at the Red Robin, how many of you all have seen the commercial on TV now where the family's gathered around the dinner table and there's a basket there and everybody has their phone in but Dad? And the children can say, that, and I'm a grandmother. When they come to my house now, so I'm no biscuits. Oh, no biscuits.
Chalkboards, and they have all kinds of other stuff. So to be fair, but I was just amazed that.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Thank our panel. They did a great job. In the league, and thank you all so much. Please, there's resources in the back, and you've seen the panel's names at the front, and they'd be glad to talk to you as well. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.